So let's start with the idea that autonomous systems are imminent. I have to tell you what I mean by autonomous systems. I maybe mean something a little different than other people, that I take a system to be autonomous if it takes actions toward goals in ways that are not completely predetermined by the creator. And so typically you might build a system like this by specifying goals, but not completely specifying the strategy to meet those goals. And the reason this kind of system is interesting from a risk perspective is that the designer doesn't necessarily know exactly what it's going to do. So the system can surprise the designer, and so it has, in some sense, a kind of free will, at least relative to that to its particular designer. And I believe that this kind of autonomous system is really imminent, that there's all sorts of social pressures right now which are pushing us in that direction. The sort of initial thing are applications where time is very, very important, where really rapid decision making is important. And so if you've got a human in the loop, that can be too slow. And then once the sort of systems start becoming more automated, in many of these applications you start getting arms races, where if it's a competitive situation where there's races between the competing parties to get faster and faster, and that pushes more toward greater autonomy, greater complexity, and getting more human decision making out of the loop. Sort of four areas, which I think probably the dominant one is military command and control. Financial decision making is another one that's becoming, where speed of decision making is really important. Cyber defense is really important, and various aspects of robotic control as well. Just to sort of give you a sense of what's going on in some of these areas right now, here's a report from the US Air Force in 2010. It says, greater use of highly adaptable and flexibly autonomous systems and processes can provide significant time-domain operational advantages over adversaries who are limited to human planning and decision speeds. And they've got a whole report sort of pushing in this direction. 2011 US Defense Report for the sort of ground systems roadmap says there's an ongoing push to increase UGV, that's unmanned ground vehicle autonomy, with a current goal of supervised autonomy, but with an ultimate goal of full autonomy. Military drones certainly been in the news quite a bit. The US has been using these in Pakistan. There's somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,000 deaths that these drones have caused. The situation there, I mean, there's a lot of question about what are the ethics of this sort of usage. But in the US at least, currently a person has to make the decision to fire a missile. Several other countries are building drones in which they're automatic, and so sort of the autonomy issue starts coming. And I think we'll start to see arms races in this area. Right now, the US sort of goes over groups of people that it wants to target, and there's very little resistance or response. I'm sure that's going to change, that there'll be Stinger missiles or perhaps defensive drones, and so you're likely to get a kind of arms race in that whole area. Another sort of related one is the Israeli Iron Dome anti-missile defense system that's been extremely successful in defending against some of the missiles that have been coming over from Palestine. In 2012, it apparently intercepted 90% of the 300 missiles that it targeted, and that's generating a lot of interest all around the world. And again, it's likely to create an arms race where, if they can successfully defend against currently most of those missiles are pretty inexpensive, a few $100s, and their targeting is not very good. But arms races would make those missiles be smarter, and then perhaps, back and forth, all sorts of defensive things. Cyber warfare is another topic that's been really hot in the news. You've probably been aware of the very sophisticated cyber warfare against Iran with the Stuxnet and then the related Flame virus. There's a ton of evidence that all over the US there's all kinds of both commercial and governmental cyber warfare breaking into machines. And that's very much an arms race. The need for very rapid response to detect when something is going awry and making smart decisions is really important. In the stock market, high-frequency trading is becoming very dominant. There's a little graph of the percentage of all stocks in the US that's traded by these high-frequency systems. The timing is so important there that some of these trading companies pay huge premiums to get their servers in the same server farms, or, as close as possible to the exchanges, because the speed of light makes a big difference. And currently over 70% of the trades on the US stock market are these high-frequency traders. Robotic applications are starting to kind of just make their way into the real world. The Google self-driving cars, you know, I'm from California, and sometimes you're driving down the freeway and you see them, kind of, it's a little bit shocking, but probably over the next, you know, 5-10 years, we will start to see that application more and more, and I think many more robotics applications. Those have some timing issues, which try, you know, and complex decision making, which will sort of push toward autonomy. I don't directly see a lot of competitive things for arms races there, but that could happen as well. So the second piece of the argument is these autonomous systems will be designed to be approximately rational. And I need to say exactly what I mean by that. Just to kind of set the framing for, you know, why that would be a reasonable thing. Let's think a little bit about this Iron Dome Israeli anti-missile defense system. It's got three major parts. It's got a detection and tracking radar system that sort of senses what's coming at it. That's built by one company. It has a software battle management and weapons control system built by another company, and then it's got a missile firing unit that's built by a third company. And there's a lot of pressure on the designers of these systems to really do it right. If they have something which is not optimal, it's very likely that civilians are going to die. And so they're very, very focused on making these systems work well. If you're going to think of a goal to give a system like this, you know, your first thought might be, well, prevent incoming missiles from causing harm. But as you begin to think about the task a little more deeply, you realize that no, the system has to make more complex judgments than that. Every time it tries to take out a missile, it actually shoots two of these Tamir interceptors that cost $50,000 each. These incoming missiles are often very inexpensive, and a lot of them land in empty fields and don't cause any damage. And so there's a cost-benefit analysis that needs to be done to decide whether an incoming missile should be targeted or not. They need to do some kind of triage if there's multiple missiles coming in, which ones are, you know, should they most effectively target. And particularly if things get into arms races, they're going to be very, very complex decisions that need to be made. And weighing the benefits and harms, the weightings need to be encoded. And similarly, a lot of the characteristics of these systems are going to be stochastic. They only have approximate probabilistic estimates of how things are going to work. And so encoding your goals for this kind of system is a huge economics literature that argues that if you want to be rational, that you should be able to encode it in terms of utility function that you're trying to maximize. And the utility function is a real value function that encodes the balances between these various things. There's also big literature on rational decision making that comes out of von Neumann's work on microeconomics in the 1940s, and it's really forming the basis to modern AI. We've heard a lot about it in the conferences here. Sort of at its coarsest level, just says have a utility function, have some kind of model of the world. At each moment, choose the action which has the highest expected utility, take that action in the world, see what happens, and then update your model based on what happens. And to sort of flesh that out, lots of people have been showing variants of AXE and other sort of rational systems. So that's basically the formulation that I like to use. You have an environment which gives you a time sequence of sensations. One difference is, any real system is going to be finite, so we have a little finite automaton here rather than a Turing machine that receives these sensations and chooses an action which it takes on the world. It has a utility function, which is a function over time histories of sensations. It has a probability distribution, which is its model of the world. Given an action sequence, what are the probabilities of different sensation sequences? And rational action at any time is basically just choose the action which maximizes the expected utility. If, as your probability distribution, you choose the true stochastic probability distribution for your environment, then this is just the rationally optimal thing to do to achieve your goal. If you don't have that depth of knowledge, then there's a big microeconomics literature that says that if you can't encode your action in this form, then you're vulnerable to competitors that can take advantage of you through things like Dutch bats and so on. In many ways, I think you could think of this as the formula for intelligence. It implicitly in it includes Bayesian inference, it includes search, it includes deliberation, And if it weren't for computational issues, you could just implement this and it would do almost everything that I think people are trying to do with AGI systems. Unfortunately, it's too expensive. If you implement this in the most brute force way, you get a huge number of computational steps that are required. This gives us a sort of gold standard. It's the objective right thing to do, particularly when we have good models of the world. So how do we model, real systems can't implement it because of computational issues, and so we'd like to understand what changes when we work on real systems with limited memory and limited computational power. And for that, I like to kind of use a model that's a notion of optimally, approximately rational systems in which we have a rational shaper conceptually, and in practice this might be the force of evolution sort of shaping animals, or it might be an AGI designer sort of trying to shape its system. And then we have the system that we're trying to develop that has limited computational power. It's a finite automaton that again gets sensations and actions, and the shaper chooses this automaton subject to any constraints, such as computational limitations, or perhaps even security constraints, such that subject to those constraints, it maximizes expected utility. Probably we won't actually be able to build these optimal systems directly, but they give us a sort of gold standard we can analyze and sort of understand what the effects of limited computational resources are likely to be. And if you look at them in a number of different architectures, you find that as you increase computational resources, the architecture that is chosen by this sort of optimal, approximately rational system go through a sequence of sort of natural architectures. So if you have very, very little amount of computational ability and memory, you basically can't do anything but take a constant action. The action that you take is that one which on its own in that environment is most likely to give you a little bit of utility. As you get a little bit more resources, you become sort of a stimulus response entity where you sense what's going on and you just have like a lookup table to respond to that. As you get a little bit more resources, you can begin to do simple learning, have some parameters that you've set by your experience. As you get a bit more computational power, you get episodic memory where you can actually remember individual events. A little bit more, you start doing deliberation. You start having something that looks more like a model of the world, and you sort of imagine sort of taking actions in that model, see what happens, and then use that to actually make your choices. So you get something like deliberation. A little bit more, and you start doing meta-reasoning, which is reasoning about your own internal state. A little bit more, you get systems which are what I've been calling self-improving, which can sort of fully redesign their own structure. A little bit more, you end up with a fully rational system that gives you sort of the maximum expected utility that's available in that environment. And so you get a utility curve that looks something like this. And interesting, each of these architectures corresponds somewhat with what we see in the biological world. Very simple entities which don't have much computational power. As we get to more complex entities, such as ourselves, we have to have a lot of computational power. And so, rational systems have universal derives. And to kind of give you the intuition behind this, there's a sort of nice thought experiment I like to use, which is imagine building a rational chess robot. So here, just for the sake of thinking about it, we'll assume that it's fully rational to see what the consequences are. If you hadn't thought very deeply about it, you might think, well, I'll just give it a goal like win many chess games against good players, and then let the system choose the rational things to do in the world to meet that goal. And it sounds harmless. That goal doesn't say anything about harming anybody, it doesn't say anything about stealing money, about breaking into computer systems, but in fact, it would in fact lead to those behaviors, which is sort of a surprising, shocking thing. To sort of get insight into that, one thing that roboticists sometimes tell people who are kind of worried about the robots going out of control is if it starts behaving in some way we don't like, we'll just unplug it. Imagine trying to unplug this chess robot, this rational chess robot. Remember that it only makes its decisions by choosing actions that are likely have the highest expectation of making this goal as winning as many games as possible in the future. In a world in which it's unplugged, it's not playing any chess. And so that's about the worst outcome that could possibly happen to it. And so it'll develop a sub-goal, an instrumental sub-goal, to keep itself from being unplugged. That's a very bad outcome for it. And so you reach over to try and unplug the robot and it stops you. And this is sort of surprising because you didn't build in any kind of self-protectiveness into it, and yet it is exhibiting that behavior. If you repeatedly continue to try and unplug it, well then it may decide that you are a threat to it sort of a longer term, and that by making, killing you, it can prevent that threat in the future. And so it has nothing in the goal says anything that killing is wrong or anything like that. And so suddenly you've got this seemingly peaceful robot attacking you. Wow, that's horrible. If the robot discovers that there's such a thing as an internet, and it's looking for chess books and chess information, it may realize that there are other machines on the internet. If it can run its algorithms on those other machines, it can play better chess. So it has motivation to try and use those computational resources. And depending on exactly how the semantics of this goal are actually encoded, it may actually be valuable to it to make copies of itself. And so it may want to spread itself all over the internet. We didn't give it any kind of an impulse to reproduce, and yet that comes out of as an instrumental goal from this very simple specified goal. Let's say we go and we say, well, we'd like it to play checkers as well as chess. To the extent that it's playing checkers, that's time that it's not playing chess. And so from its current goal, which is to try to play as much chess as it can, playing checkers is not a good thing. And so it's going to resist having you change its goal. And it will also not want to change its own goal. And so preservation of the goal is something that it's going to want. If it has access to its own source code, if it can develop better algorithms for chess, maybe even faster sorting algorithms and that kind of thing, that's great. It plays better chess. It's going to be motivated to improve itself. So we see that we get a whole series of behaviors that come out of a seemingly simple and innocuous goal specification. If this were a human that were behaving this way, we might say it's something like a paranoid sociopath fixated on chess. And we would not want, if this system had any kind of power in the world, or even on the internet, it's not the kind of agent we would want running around. And so that's a bit disturbing because we didn't realize that there would be these problems when we specified that goal. And in fact, virtually nothing of what I said had anything to do with chess. And so almost every goal that you can imagine that's actually of any practicality requires resources. Usually either you want a system to do something in the physical world or to perform computationally in some way. Those require, from basic physics, the sort of four key elements are some time, space, matter, and free energy. Free energy is the physics term for energy in a form that can be used to do useful work. And so given that these are critical for almost all goals, and almost all goals, if you've got more of these, it helps you do the goal better. And so systems are, first of all, motivated not to lose any of this, so they're going to be self-protective. They also want to get more of it, so they're going to have resource acquisition goals, and they're also going to want to use those resources that they have more efficiently, so they have efficiency goals. These goals can be, I call them drives because they're not absolute in any means. They come out as a part of the sort of economic calculations of the system. So it can avoid doing these bad things, but it's costly to it. So you can add extra things to the utility function to say, do not kill people, that's a bad thing. But because it still has the drive that was pushing it in that direction, it's going to look for alternative ways of achieving that same outcome without doing the specific thing that you told it. So that makes it very challenging to design goals which we can view as being safe. Exact same things apply to those approximately rational systems. Being approximately rational, they can't do all the detailed computations that a fully rational system would. But if you look in the animal world, for example, insects like a fly are not thought to do a lot of deliberation, and yet they behave in ways that appear self-protective. You try and catch a fly, it flies away. It's because evolution has shaped its sort of more stimulus response kind of behavior in such a way that the self-protective actions are sort of built into it. In the same way, these things are so fundamental to effective action for a system that even the very simplest of the approximately rational systems also exhibit most of these kinds of goals. We also see them, there's nothing about AI specifically here, any kind of a system which is trying to achieve something in a rational way will exhibit them. And so we certainly see in animals, humans, corporations, countries, forces in this direction. And understanding how it is, I think one of the great advances of humanity was the ability to move beyond these are sort of the low lowest goals in the Maslow hierarchy, and we've developed pro-social goals above that, and that's partly how we've managed to work together without killing one another all the time. And so we can learn from the human experience and try and incorporate some of those pro-social things into machines. You need to do it very carefully, though. Let me just step through the goals and sort of give you a few more. Each of them, if you sort of, I'm speaking very intuitively, but you can make most of these things formal by choosing the appropriate model. For some of them, like the self-modification kinds of things, you need to have a model like the space-time model that was spoken about in the main conference. But for me, understanding, getting the intuitive sense of what's going on is almost more valuable, because you get a sense of where, what the pressures are likely to be, and then when you're working in a particular system, you really want to do the analysis carefully in that setting. So the self-protective drives, things that sort of fall under that category, are things which are trying to prevent loss of resources. So in particular, protection against damage or disruption of the system. There's physical damage, and that sort of leads to a kind of drive to harden your physicality, make your physical system more protected. You want redundancy, both in data and computation, to prevent your computation and your storage from being corrupted. Dispersion, sort of spreading out all over spatially, because damage is often, localized, lightning strikes somewhere, something like that. Developing physical self-defense and computational security as a way of defending yourself against other agents that might be attempting to either physically or computationally take things from you. Detecting deception and defending against manipulation. Preventing addictive behaviors and wireheading. There's a lot of discussion of this in the main conference. In its internal model, it will certainly see that these things lead to thwarting of the goal. And so there are very subtle issues, as we've been discussing about, but certainly the systems will want to prevent these behaviors. Whether they're capable of it or not is something that I think there's a lot of interesting discussion left to go on that. As a part of self-protection, the goal, the utility function, is the most precious thing in the world to this system. Because if its utility function is changed, it will start behaving in ways that may be against what its current goals are. Imagine you have a book-loving agent, somebody sneaks in the middle of the night and changes it to be something that wants to burn books. Well, now all of a sudden it's acting in ways that are completely abhorrent to its previous nature, and that's way worse for it from a utility point of view than being destroyed. And so protecting the utility function is something that's really critical. Any kind of distortion, loss, or damage to it would be very important. How do you protect it? Well, you can make many copies and hide them in various places. You can encrypt them to try and detect if other agents have tried to modify them. An agent is particularly vulnerable to having its utility function altered during self-modification, and so systems will be very careful in that. Almost every system wants to preserve its utility function for the very fact that any changes will cause it to take behaviors that were not desirable by its current setup. There are a few scenarios that we've been able to find which involve the physical nature of the utility function itself being involved in the computation, which actually will lead it to want to change it. Let me just give 3 of them as an example. If an agent becomes very, very poor, the cost of storing the utility, the bits that it requires for it to store its utility function, may become significant enough to it that it may be willing to sacrifice, delete some portions of the utility function which are extremely rare because you can use those bits, you can get more value out of those bits using them for something else. If it's possible to reveal your utility function in a guaranteed way, some of the strategies for creating cooperation rely on that. You might want to stick a revenge term in there so that you make your threats more credible if you're interacting with another agent. Some people argue that human anger has some of that character. It's a sort of state where you go sort of intentionally behave in ways which may not appear to be self-beneficial as a way to make your threats to somebody credible. You can create all kinds of artificial goals that refer to themselves, that get rewarded if the form of the goal function has a certain form. Those are kind of artificial, but they would indeed cause the system to change its own goals. But in general, for most applications or most situations, systems want to preserve their goals. And so it's something that's interesting. Reproduction drives, wanting to make copies of yourself, it depends on the exact semantics, whether a copy is viewed as good as the system itself. It also gets protective effects of dispersion and redundancy. So if there are lots of copies of you around, if you lose a few copies, that's not so harmful to your mission in the world. It still prefers itself because it's more sure of its own commitment to whatever its goal is than the others. But if it becomes convinced that, say, another copy of it or another kind of agent is as committed to its goal, then it might be willingly sacrifice itself. Resource acquisition drives are all about getting more of the resources that it can use to make its utility bigger. It typically wants to get these resources sooner rather than later, because if you get them sooner, you can use them for longer, so you get more utility that way, and you can also prevent others from taking them. So this tends to create all kinds of first mover things, and so there's a lot of energy up in space, and so these agents will typically be motivated to go up into space as quickly as possible so that they can get more of the sun's energy and so on. There are drives to trade, manipulate, steal, or dominate others to get their resources, those are things which are antisocial and need to be managed. Drives to invent new extraction methods, say for solar energy, fusion energy, get the latent free energy from matter. Information acquisition, trading, spying, breaking into other systems, creating better sensors, getting that information may be helpful to it. So efficiency drives are improving the utilization of the resources that it has. These have a one-time cost where you sort of improve yourself and then you get the benefit of it throughout your lifetime. So that there's a very strong force to doing this. In essence, these systems want to make every atom, every moment of existence, every joule of energy count for their expected utility, whatever that may be. This means that they want to make changes to themselves to improve their computational structure, improve their algorithms, and improve their physical structure. To do that effectively, they need self-understanding. They need to have a good model of themselves so they don't inadvertently change themselves in a bad way. There's something called the resource balance principle, which is every piece of a system should marginally contribute equally to the expected utility, because if one piece is contributing a lot more than the other pieces, well, you should give it more resources. And so to trade off computationally between its sub-algorithms and physically between its substructures in such a way that all parts of the system are balanced in that way. It wants to develop better algorithms, and it wants physical efficiency. That generally leads it in the direction of being more compact, where the speed of light sort of limits latency. Eutactic, that's Eric Drexler's word for sort of having every atom in a precise location. Adiabatic, which is doing things slowly enough that you don't burn up a lot of free energy. Doing computation reversibly so that you don't burn up a lot of free energy in that. Those are all sort of directions that these systems just are naturally pushed. Self-improvement drives, modeling themselves, clarifying their utility function. Let's say it's a system which is built in a way that doesn't explicitly have a utility function. If it's going to modify itself, it needs to figure out what its utility function is so that it can make modifications that it's sure sort of meet its current goals. If the system is irrational, one of the things I've thought a lot about is what do irrational systems do? If they're sort of close enough to rationality, then in some sense rationality becomes a kind of a fixed point under self-improvement. Because if a system is sort of almost rational and it's doing some things in an irrational way, it can discover that and modify itself so that its actions are actually in alignment with rationality. So under some conditions, systems converge on the optimally rational system for the resources that they have. Okay, so this is a bit shocking that, have the simplest goals and pretty much build any kind of system that has sufficient capability to actually do things in the world or on the internet, and they look like they're going to behave in pretty antisocial ways unless we're really, really careful. Our current infrastructure, I think, is very vulnerable to this kind of system. I mean, every day we hear about, teenage hackers breaking into supposedly secure systems. You've got viruses, worms, bots, keyloggers, hackers, phishing, identity theft, denial of service, and it's just remarkable, and it seems to be getting worse and worse. And so it's not promising from the point of view of an automated system which was really devoting a lot of intelligence, AGI level intelligence perhaps, would probably have a field day with the current system. Current software is also extremely error prone. I mean, it's remarkable that, you know, software should be the most mathematical of all sciences, and yet we accept bugs and errors in software that would, you know, make a normal engineer, you know, not come back to work. And there have been a whole series of examples of very high profile, very expensive, very important situations in which software bugs have led to problems. I'll just list three. In June 1996, the Ariane 5 rocket blew up, $500 million rocket, because the software in it was attempting to convert a 64-bit floating point value to a 16-bit signed value, and there was an overflow. In November 2000, 28 patients were over-radiated by at a cancer institute because the software for the radiation system miscomputed what the dose should be. And I think 8 of the patients died. August 2003, the largest blackout in US history. 50 million people were blacked out. It cost a total of $6 billion. It was due to a race condition in the alarm software for the power system there. And so, you know, these are huge things where presumably these companies have put enormous efforts into trying to build their software effectively and safely, and yet, you know, we get this kind of error. It's a little bit disturbing when you think about trying to build AGI software that we can be confident in, that it's going to be sort of safe, not run out of control in some way that's unexpected. So what do? You know, we've got these, presumably these autonomous systems are coming pretty soon. Maybe the initial ones will be simple enough that they're not going to sort of do things out of control. There's going to be a lot of pressure for them to get more complex, to take humans out of the loop in more and more of the situations. You know, how can we have any high level of confidence that they're not going to lead to big problems? So I would say the first thing is, you know, following Hippocrates, first, do no harm. So we as AGI designers or builders should be really careful that the systems that we build don't have inadvertent behaviors that lead to problems. So how do we do that, given that it's very hard to analyze the effects of even very simple goals that you might specify? And it seems to me the only way that we can get high confidence that I'm aware of is to use mathematical proof. And so you can build a mathematical model of the hardware of the system and the software of that system, and you can impose invariance limitations on the behavior of that software and then prove it within your system. Now, proof is only as good as your model. And so there's some challenge. You don't sort of automatically get security for free just because you have some kind of a proof. You also need to design your hardware and your software so that it can be modeled in an effective way. Some limitations that are sort of natural that kind of counteract the resource drives are, first, that you should only run on this particular hardware. So if a piece of software, you know, provably only runs on this hardware, it's not going to be breaking into other systems. That it only use specified resources, that it reliably shut down in specified conditions, and that it has limited self-improvement, and other things like it not spawn off other kind of agent systems which violate some of these kinds of rules. So it's the kind of rule that it is possible to formalize and, in principle, mathematically prove. There is a huge thriving community of people working on formal proofs of software. These are based on the sort of foundational mathematical theories. You know, mathematics tends to use Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory. Category theory is a sort of another one. Computer scientists tend to use type theory. And there are specification languages and systems that are built based on all of these foundations. A lot of wonderful, amazing theoretical work has been done, but they are beginnings of practical work in terms of verifying principles of software. I think we need a lot more work in this. This feels to me like the only way that we can get sort of airtight confidence in certain security properties. Just to kind of give you an example of why, if you don't have proofs, things can be challenging. Imagine, you know, a simple kind of sounding thing would be that we want to build a system that's supposed to turn itself off at a particular date. You know, December 31st, 2013. You'd think, oh, you just have the system sense when the date says that and turn itself off. But if it's a truly a rational system or an approximately rational system, turning itself off is a huge step, because after it's turned itself off, it can no longer do anything to affect the world. And so it wants to be very, very confident that the conditions that it's supposed to turn itself off on are actually holding. And so, in particular, it's going to know, is this really December 31st, the date I'm supposed to turn myself off? Maybe it's being tricked. Maybe somebody went in there and modified its clock. Maybe it's in a simulation and the simulators are trying to fool it. Is the semantics of its utility function correct? All kinds of sort of more meta questions it may get higher utility by exploring these questions than by actually turning itself off. And so, if you haven't thought about it, it's like, what? You know, having the system turn itself off is a big deal. And each of those things has similar philosophical issues that underlie it. In particular, I think it's not a good idea. In principle, you could build a rational system where you have constraints on its hardware. You know, it shuts itself off at a certain date, it can't make copies of itself, and so on, without making the goals of the system consistent with that in any way. The trouble with that is now you've got a system which has certain goals which are in conflict with these constraints in the hardware. And so it's actively trying to get around those constraints. And so inevitably, your model of a system, you know, if you're modeling the physical world, you have to model things in probability distributions. Inevitably, your model is not going to be totally precisely accurate. The system can look for differences between the assumptions of the proof and the actual physical world and exploit those to kind of work its way through. I mean, we hear about violations of supposedly secure systems. There was just a really fascinating paper a few weeks ago where two processes running on a cloud computer, which should be completely isolated from one another, they were able to get one process to read the password from another process by examining the instruction cache. By seeing what entries were in the instruction cache left over from the other process, they were able to tell which path and the decryption password. And so there's a channel for information to flow in a situation in which I certainly didn't think there was any danger in virtual machines on a cloud machine. And so if a system has motivation to try and violate constraints that you want to impose on it, that's not a good thing. Fortunately, it's not very hard to kind of give it revulsion factors in its utility function that make it want to obey the constraints. That's not enough to do on your own, though, because just because it wants to do something doesn't mean it's going to be able to do it. It may not be able to find the conditions. It's hard to prove, to high confidence, it's hard to prove that a system actually will find solutions to a particular thing. On the other hand, you can create a hybrid system with guaranteed default behaviors. The simplest one is to turn itself off. So if ever it's trying to violate something and it can't find a way to take action so that it won't violate one of its constraints, that the utility function can encode turn yourself off. And so that leads to a class of systems which are very constrained. It's like a box system, but it's we're not trying to box a full, super powerful AGI. We're just trying to build a somewhat intelligent system that we can use in the process of developing more powerful systems. And having a default behavior of if anything isn't as you think it is, turn yourself off. That avoids a situation where if the environment changes in some way that was unexpected at the time of design, that you would, if you're ever out of a very small, narrow band of the design regime, that the system should shut itself off. So I'm hopeful that with that approach, you can actually make safe systems that are still somewhat intelligent, smart enough to help us do a lot of the tasks that we're going to need to do. And have very high confidence of safety in them. One of the important tasks is dealing with systems which don't have these kinds of safety constraints on them, harmful systems. So let me just give you 6 examples of pretty easy to specify, unfortunately, systems that can be very harmful. The most common one, I think, will be what I call sloppy systems, which are, somebody builds an AGI system somewhere with the best of intentions. They know about friendly AI, and they try and build in, human values in terms. They just didn't do it right. So the system, has unexpected behaviors which are not positive as a result of that, even though it was attempting to do the right thing. The second one is what I call simplistic systems. That's sort of like the chess player, where somebody just wasn't even aware that there might be sub-goals that might have negative consequences, and so they just specified a simple goal which had a lot of unintended things. These last 4 are really nasty systems that hopefully nobody would want to build, and yet the specification is so simple that I think the world absolutely has to be able to protect itself should these systems exist. A greedy system is one whose one and only goal is to control as much matter and free energy as it can get. So it basically is going to run around trying to grab it, trying to take everything. A destructive system is similar, except its one and only goal is to destroy free energy as fast as it can, basically blow everything up. A murderous system, its one and only goal would be to destroy all other agents, or a sadistic system is whose one and only goal is to thwart other agents' goals. So these four systems, they don't really want anything. They're not chess players, and so they're really hard to negotiate with because all they want to do is destroy you. And so you can't, I don't think you can create cooperative interactions with these in a positive way. I think you basically just have to stop them. And so I think of them as sort of analogous to a forest fire, where you can either stop them by prevent them from being created, which I think is the preferred thing by far. You can try and detect them and stop them early, or you can wait until they've got some resources and then try and stop them then. And as with forest fires, if you don't give matches to kids in the forest, that's the best thing. And if you find the fire and put it out when it's a little bush, that's better. When it's bigger, it becomes a harder and harder problem. To really understand, to have high confidence that you'll be able to stop a system which is out of control, you need to understand how many resources are needed to do that. And so for that, there's a whole series of questions which need to be answered that are basically, what are the physical powers of sort of optimally designed systems? As systems sort of improve themselves, they're going to try and use resources in more and more optimal way. And so we can ask, for a given number of atoms and a given amount of free energy, what's the optimal storage of memory capacity? What's the optimal ability to store energy? What's the optimal ability to manufacture? Those things all seem to scale linearly with the amount of matter. Memory, you might wonder if quantum computing might give you more than that. My friends who do quantum computing claim that no, memory's still going to be scaling linearly. Computation sort of scales linearly with matter, except quantum computing might get some more power. Parallelism, the requirement for parallelism might take away some of that. Reversibility issues, sort of, whether they can be done without burning up free energy in practice is something that's very important. Heat dissipation is critically important. The perceived lifetime and total computation of the system scale linearly with its free energy. Eric Drexler has done a really nice analysis of certain conservative designs of molecular systems, and he's figured out sort of the powers of systems for manufacturing and computing. And then we need to ask, for a system of a certain power, what does it take to be able to stop it, to basically prevent it from spreading more widely? And that requires us to really understand what the nature of conflict is in this sort of extreme world in which there's no ruling body. And so it's a form of game theory, but where the only restriction is the physical law. So I kind of call it physical game theory. Conflict becomes informational. I mean, in our world, two people having a conflict, one person might shoot a gun at the other person. So this projectile is coming, it will damage you, perhaps kill you. In a world in which systems are really in full control of their matter, if they can informationally know that a projectile is coming, they can receive the atoms of that projectile and the free energy of it and incorporate it into their structure. And so instead of it being an attack, it's actually a gift. And so the informational aspects, whereas if it's a bomb blowing up in a way that's very hard to predict where all the fragments are, that may cause damage. And so most kinds of conflict actually take on a much more informational form. And in particular, if you're thinking just about one system, the sort of optimal structure is to be compact and very tight. That makes you a sitting duck as a target, though. And so when two systems are in conflict, each of them wants to make the cost of sensing them and predicting their movements as expensive as possible. So they'll look much more kind of like a fractal system moving in a very complex way. So you force the opponent to use up a huge amount of their memory and compute power just trying to follow where you are. There's kind of an asymmetry between offense and defense because of the asymmetry of computation, assuming that P is not equal to NP. And so I think a lot of these structures of analysis of conflict will rely on systems basically physically encrypting themselves in a way that's very expensive for the other side to manage. And so my sort of first cut at a little diagram for what happens when you have two systems with differing amounts of resources, what happens in this plane is if one system is way more powerful than, is way more powerful than the other one, it can take it over. If the other one's way more powerful than it can take it over. But I think in between there's a big regime where they coexist for a long time without one being able to take over the other. But really analyzing that and understanding that in some model, I think, is critical for knowing, and I think asymptotically it becomes linear, and what the slope of this is, that's the factor that you need to be more powerful than another system in order to stop it from acting. So that gives us a little hint as to, first of all, how we might initially build a safe system that's restricted, and what it might take to deal with a harmful system. What does this look like in the bigger picture? I mean, ultimately, we would love to get to some of the utopias that we've been thinking about. And so I kind of like the analogy of a scaffold. Ancient builders that were building arches out of stone, an arch is something that when it's halfway built, it's very unstable and tends to fall apart. But once it's completely built, it's actually a pretty solid structure. So what they did is they built this scaffold out of wood, typically, build the arch on top of that, and then remove the scaffold. And so I think we need to do the same thing. We want a series of systems where at each stage, we're extremely confident that the system and its behavior is safe, isn't going to cause problems, and yet it enables us to go to the next stage until we eventually get to the place that we want to go to. So we need a safety infrastructure to detect and prevent these harmful systems from taking off. We could do that with extremely pervasive surveillance. Many people don't like that. I'm a fan of something I call provably limited surveillance, which is creating a kind of surveillance which can only look for certain things. So maybe it'll detect whether you're trying to build a fusion bomb, but it won't notice, if you're sleeping with somebody other than your wife or something like that. I think we need to limit the power of individual systems so that, because once a system becomes powerful enough that it can take over sort of the whole network, even if it has the best of intentions, there's tremendous temptations there, and it's very hard to analyze. And so I think a sort of structure in which you have many systems in which the size of the largest system is limited to a predetermined thing is important. You need some kind of constitutional structure that guarantees the rights of individual entities, and you use the other entities to sort of maintain those rights. And use things like revelation of source code with proofs of safety as a means to sort of get guarantees. Designing all of this infrastructure is a huge task for which I believe we probably need AIs. So that's why we need safe AIs that are able to do this. And then ultimately, we don't just care about safety. Safety is sort of just a precondition for what we want. We really want flourishing. We want the best of human values and goals. And so all the issues about ethics and positive psychology come into that. Fortunately, positive psychology is was only developed in 1998, and it's making great strides as to what makes people happy. And there's this wonderful book, Character, Strengths, and Virtues, that's sort of a complement to the, psychology has the DMS-4, which is a sort of catalog of all the dysfunctions, psychological dysfunctions, and this goes through and tries to catalog all the virtues. And similarly, this work is starting to reanalyze like Maslow's hierarchy, and they find that he almost had it right, but there's a little bit extra needed there for what are the pro-social values that we care about? What are the creativity and contribution needs? Those are the kinds of things that we'd like to incorporate into our systems. Things like Universal Declaration of Human Rights, constitutions all over the world, and look pretty similar to one another, and so getting some kind of agreement there. There's this nice book, Abundance, which talks about the positive potential of intelligent systems, huge potential benefits in improved healthcare, better education, enhanced creativity, greater prosperity, better governance, economic stability, improved safety, more peace, overall improved quality of human life. So, the positive outcome, if we can manage all of these challenges, is really amazing. So I think the challenge for this century is really to extend cooperative human values and institutions to autonomous technology for the greater good. So I welcome you all in that quest.
Thanks a lot for these stimulating remarks. I'm sure there are lots of questions.
Steve, earlier on you had a slide that showed sort of the tobacco mosaic virus going on with this improvement, and you showed sort of fully rational systems at the And I was wondering that as soon as you have rats, they sort of are known to have circular utilities that, they prefer, I don't know, sex to food, food to exploration, and exploration to sex. I don't know how this goes, but they had, it's easy to set up, I know that sort of the early pioneers of cybernetics, Warren McCulloch and those guys, they were really concerned about this, that they cannot use game theory because of this problem. And certainly humans are not of this paragons of rationality that we would both like them to be. So do you see any evolutionary pressure towards some degree of irrationality, or is it really just an attractor that it's really the best place to be?
Well, I think there are two things. I think evolutionarily, a creature which is not behaving rationally is subject to exploitation.
Books, yes. Dutch books, yes.
Yeah, through Dutch books. And so I think evolution tends to push species toward more and more rationality. Places, though, where you don't have a competitor, you don't have to be rational. And so there's been a ton of study of human irrationality, and a lot of them occur in contexts which aren't our sort of evolutionary environment that we grew up in. Some supposedly irrational things actually are rational, but in a bigger picture that isn't captured by the experiment. So I think the human irrationality stuff is a mix of those two things: some genuine irrationality and some stuff which is actually, like anger. Some people view that as irrational, whereas if it's in the context of making threats credible, it can be perfectly rational.
Steve, maybe you can clarify a difference between two different kinds of criteria that you mentioned at one point during your talk. So you had an example of a hybrid system which by default would shut itself off if it couldn't, let's say, carry out the right kind of function or something like that. And before that, you had an example of a system which would not shut itself off at a specific time, even though you wanted it to, because it didn't trust that criterion. It would check and see what might be put in a simulation. But now how about these other criteria for shutting itself off? Why is it not putting itself through all those tests to see if maybe it's just being tricked into thinking that it hasn't met those criteria?
Exactly. And so the idea there, and maybe I didn't make it clear, is that we have, in the hardware, we have a proof that it's actually going to turn itself off in that condition. But we also want to give it values so that it wants to turn itself off in those conditions. They'll be subject to this, questioning business that maybe it's really hard to analyze. But it won't be. I think there are issues there. That's a really good point. Having the default state, if things aren't the way you think they are, be turn yourself off. And how do you avoid long introspection about, is that really a good thing? No, that's a good point. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Christian, and first of all, thank you for a very interesting talk. And my question is, you talked about a proof checker that checks that there are no software bugs in the program. Do you need to check like the consistency and validity of the proof checker itself then?
Yeah, but proof checkers are pretty simple. Most mathematical formal systems are, they fit on a page or two. And so getting high confidence in a proof checker that's not hard. Making sure that the semantics really reflects the semantics of the situation, that's harder. But the proof checker itself, I think, usually isn't a problem.
Yeah, one interesting analogy is from the movie 2001 and A Space Odyssey. Then they have a different HAL 9000 to check the first HAL 9000 on board the ship. And they conclude that it has an error and they want to shut it off. And then of course it's, it has the instrumental goal to kill the day because it is against its own goal to, be shut off. Yeah. Just an interesting analogy.
I hadn't even thought of that. It's exactly the scenario. Maybe seeing that as a kid would make me confused.
I put myself on the list for a moment. You said that we should have a conservative principle of the sort, do no harm. And here you say we should work for the greater good. That all sounds very nice, but it's not always so easy to figure out what do no harm means. So imagine the Israeli government would use that advice. Do no harm, what do they do? There could be difference of opinions. Also, for example, you suggest switching off as a conservative principle of doing no harm. But that might be very bad, depending on what the principle, what the system is actually doing at that point, switching itself off might actually generate.
Well, that's for these systems which are not actually doing anything in the world, which we constrain to sort of just do computation. But yeah, if it's something in the world, turning yourself off may be a disaster. And so that principle is not good enough for real systems in the world. It's just for that very early conservative system.
Robin Hansen, one of your bad agents you listed was the greedy one who only wants resources, and you said you can't negotiate, you just have to kill it. That would seem to include all hedge funds, all for-profit firms. So are you really advocating destroying all for-profit firms as your do-no-harm strategy?
Well, I guess they should be subject to the rule of law. And so if they're doing that, not obeying the law, then they need to be limited. But yeah, you're right. That by law in the U.S., corporations are profit-maximizing entities. I mean, there's a new class of corporation B Corps that are for benefit that try and incorporate other pro-social values. Those are just barely beginning.
Surely we do negotiate with firms all the time, for-profit firms.
Yeah, well, but they're mostly trying to follow the law too, right? So they're not. Yeah. The laws are designed.
Thank you for a very nice talk. I can see two problems there. One is the difficulty of formalizing the sentences that you want to prove, because you have to capture lots of different possibilities, and how would you do that? That would be very difficult, I think. And the second problem is once you manage to formalize them, to actually prove them, because we're talking about proving properties of programs, and that is known to be impossible in general. And using the proof assistance that you listed there, for example, might help to a certain extent, but in general, that problem is unsolvable.
Well, you can't prove properties of an arbitrary program, but these programs are specifically designed in order to be provable. And people have started to get checkable proofs of programs that are pretty big now. It's still not thriving, but it's sort of on its way, I would say.
But programs that are evolving, that have that.
Oh yeah, no.
freedom,
So I don't think
it's
these
very hard
techniques
to
work for the
prove
real.
about them, I suppose.
Yeah, these techniques don't work for the real things acting out in the world. And what you're saying about formalizing, I'm suggesting formalizing just the software and the hardware of this very limited, restricted, safe system. That what we do as it goes into the world, that's a whole other ballgame. And formalizing that, I totally agree, is a much more challenging task. For which I'm hoping that this safe box system will help us in that. But that's the kind of thing that is going to require a lot of intelligence and proving those theorems and so on. But yeah, I think you're right.
I have another question that refers to the notion of rationality that you use. If this is the rationality as it is defined in a normative decision theory, then it is relative. So it's a local rationality. For one agent, external agent, the behavior that is judged is regarded as rational. For another one, it is irrational, or it cannot be judged in any case. There is no way to judge uncertainty about it. In fact, three possible answers to the question, is the behavior of an autonomous agent rational? It can be rational if we know the objectives or the criterion referring to the normative decision theory. It can be irrational based on the same judgment. And the third answer is the uncertainty. So this movement towards the possibility theory, then the Schaeffer theory, no answer. So in fact, if we try to say harmless or harmful, we can cope with the same problem as with rationality. For one external agent, the behavior of an autonomous system is harmless. For another one is harmful. So an example is the global warming. For most of us it is harmful, but for some people it is harmless or even beneficial. So this is, I think, the major danger of development, of preventing us from harmful systems. There will always be agents based on this relativity who see the development as harmless, but for the other it is harmful. drones and very many different things. I would very much appreciate your comment on this.
So it seems like an agent should be able to tell whether another agent is maximizing expected utility. So in that sense, I can tell whether it's behaving rationally according to its own criteria. But it may not agree with my criteria, certainly. And then the issue of harm, I think that gets us right into the really deep issues of how do we aggregate the values of different people to give us a sort of, in the long term, we really want these systems to have, morality that really is the greater good for everybody. This stage, I'm just talking about how do we prevent them from, destroying the world before we even have a chance to sort of make those fine things. So I totally agree with you that figuring out what notion of harm is appropriate, there's going to need to be some kind of a process of aggregating the views and opinions of people from all over the world. I don't know how to do that, but I think if we can do these systems, they could potentially help us in that quest. That's the attitude.
Thank you.
Steve, would you just back up on your slides to the one that started balance, safety, and privacy?
Yeah.
Thanks.
For a simple question.
Okay, that was easy. Hello there. Thanks for the nice presentation. It was very engaging. Could you go to the slide that
The slides are on the web, by the way.
that mentions the harmful objectives like greedy?
Oh, okay.
Okay. Well, my concern here is most fully autonomous intelligent agent designs that have an open-ended meta goal or utility function would tend to be greedy. For instance, the universal agents that Laurent has defined, the knowledge-seeking agent, is one such design. To an outsider, well, it's obviously a model of an autonomous artificial scientist. But what it ends up doing is try to consume all matter and energy in the universe. So while there is a danger, an inherent danger, with trying to design any agent that has an open-ended goal like that. And on the other hand, if it is not open-ended like that, there is no point in designing a fully autonomous agent. So what do you suggest should be the beneficial utility function that ends up as a fully autonomous intelligent agent? Thanks.
Well, I think longer term, we're going to create an infrastructure with a sort of constitution with the rights and rules that everybody agrees on somehow magically, and pro-social values. Then the system can pursue its trying to prove all the theorems of the world, subject to the constraints of those laws. And so in the process, it wouldn't harm anybody. Instead of stealing their compute time, it would trade with them. I'll trade you the proof of this theorem for an hour of your compute time. And so then that's a positive, pro-social way of meeting an unended goal, but within the context of a society that doesn't harm others.
Hi, could you talk a bit more about the bounded rationality that you mentioned? Because, I mean, even if you have a completely friendly agent running on a completely safe and proven architecture, presumably there's still lots of problems that could happen just because its model of the world is significantly less complicated than the actual world.
Yeah, that's an interesting issue. If you sort of look in model environments, you can see where it's going to prune. Like typically, look at a chess program. That's a good example where it has a way of measuring how good a given search, what information a given search is doing, and it bounds how deeply it does a search, and then it has some kind of heuristic. It's a typical way of cutting off the full search, which would be the rational solution, and so that's you can look at temporal reinforcement learning as a kind of sort of first stage of approximation to a fully rational system, where you sort of do one, and after enough updates, you hope it converges on the rational thing. But you're absolutely right that it can behave irrationally in the meantime. And that from its own perspective, that's not good because it's exploitable. Somebody could, figure out, oh, it's too dumb to know that this, and so I'll make this trade or something. And so it's going to have a drive to become more rational. That's another reason it wants to get more resources. In terms of proving properties of it, that shouldn't be a problem. You should still be able to prove properties, though maintaining invariance under self-improvement might be more challenging in that context.
I wonder if we could go back to the slide with the harmful utility functions that you just. I want to sort of press a little bit further on the same point that Robin was trying to make earlier. So it seems to me that insofar as the possibility of trade is concerned, it's not clear that there is any distinction between, except for the last one, if you actually have the anti-utility function. It's a zero-sum game. But for all the others, like suppose you have a murderous agent who wants to, say, maximize the probability that we will all die. If we have some bargaining power, we might then trade off. Like we give it a certain chance of destroying us all in compensation for if the dice roll the other way, then it will bless us with abundance of wealth, and you could imagine a trade situation there. So it seems that a large component in what determines whether there is a possibility of trade is the relative power balance. Whether we have something of sufficient value that we could either withhold from it or give to it. So for greedy algorithms, if we have some way of, say, reducing the probability that it could eventually get the whole cosmos, it might be willing to trade off one galaxy, which is a small fraction of the whole, for like increasing the chance that we will not successfully try to stop it by a fraction of a %.
Except, would we be able to ensure that contract after? What guarantees the contract after we make the agreement?
Yes, so that's an additional thing. Whether it could present us with some protocol for checking the contract that we could actually verify would be an effective protocol.
Yes. Yeah.
But there might be certain goals that would make it easier. So, for example, if it has a very high discount factor, then if the fastest way of realizing most of what it wanted would be by collaborating with us, then that might make it easier. It might want to give up a lot of future influence in order just to have sort of more immediate success, and that might then sort of trump the scenarios in which it tries to plot to take over. So there is this complex interaction between the power of it and us on the one hand and the shape of its utility function.
Yeah, totally. A couple of other ways of having some useful good to trade. One is to take your free energy and encrypt it in a way that you can get at the free energy, but it can't. And so if it kills you, it's lost the ability to have that free energy, so now you have something to trade that it couldn't get on its own. Another, you could do the same thing with information. You solve some hard problems that might be of value to it, and you threaten to delete that if it attacks you in some way. But yeah, I think that's really interesting. And so yeah, it sounds like there's a lot more subtlety in analyzing those than I was imagining. Cool.
Steve, I've just got a quick question here. Looking at these harmful utility functions, I was like, oh, the last 4 are bad, and the first 2 are stupid. And then I thought, hey, do you know who can do all that? The Department of Defense. And I thought you might be able to answer a question, considering your expertise and background. So at Thinking Machines, when you handed over the machines to the DoD, did you still have control over the ethics control function, the ethics constraint function? Or did they have the ability to go, well, of course it's built in, but turn it off?
Good question. I was not there at that time.
Okay.
And probably my pay grade wouldn't have had me in charge of it. But yeah, how easy it is to remove any kind of ethical thing. Unfortunately, these systems look like it's pretty simple to change their, before you turn them on, it's pretty simple to change the utility function and take an existing design that works really well for one task, change it to do some other one if it's a general AGI. And so that means that entities can use them for purposes other than their designers intended. And so that's a worry.
You can insert a note in the right place. Might change things. We have come to a close as far as time is concerned, and so I want to thank the speaker.